Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm Congressman Matt Gaetz, and I'd like to call our Western Hemisphere field hearing to order. We're going to begin with an invocation from Reverend Brandon Burris, pastor at Pensacola First United Methodist Church. Pastor, please lead us in the invocation.
Let us pray. Almighty God, we gather here today to find solutions to difficult problems. Guide us in these efforts. We pray against the evils in this world. We pray against those that wish to cause harm to other human beings in any form, whether it is terrorism or drug trafficking. Be with the many innocent people whose lives have been affected by these evils in this world. May the efforts here today bring about a more peaceful and safer world. Be with all those who seek to bring peace in the midst of chaos. We pray especially for those that serve on the front line, such as the military and law enforcement. God, protect them. Again, guide us and direct us this afternoon. Amen.
We have with us today the Milton High School Navy JROTC program. Please present the colors.
Color guard, post, knowledge. Freeze and colors. Ready, cut. Order. Colors. Ready. Cut. Color guard. Post. Knowledge.
I'd like to begin by thanking Reverend Brandon Burris for offering the prayer. In addition to joining us today, also served our country admirably in the armed services. I want to thank the Milton High School Navy JRTC program for the presentation of colors, and the Corey Station Performing Arts Choir for their stirring rendition of the national anthem. Thank you all for joining us. We also want to thank the entire team here at the museum, Captain Sterling Gilman, Diane Bell, Gary Peterson, and the entire team for making this lovely venue available to us for our field hearing today. Today's field hearing will focus on the threat of rising Islamic extremism in the Western Hemisphere, and particularly Latin America. And what I'd like to do to set the stage for the people who are engaged in that fight and who are helping to ensure that we win it in the United States Coast Guard and throughout our Homeland Security apparatus, we've got a quick video we'd like to play.
be the core of Western policy that there be no sanctuary for terror. And to sustain such a policy, free men and free nations must unite and work together.
Venezuela is gripped by crisis.
In Venezuela's capital, Caracas, things aren't much better. This is what a supermarket looks like. Just empty shelves, no food, no food.
Venezuela estaría sirviendo de trampolín para que personas vinculadas con el grupo terrorista Hezbollah puedan entrar a Estados Unidos y Canadá.
That Venezuela's leftist government is harboring ties to the Lebanese armed group Hezbollah. A relationship cemented by the country's late president Hugo Chavez and his friendship with Iran, and continued under his successor Nicolás Maduro. Politically, Venezuela and Hezbollah have made no secret of their mutual admiration. Some Washington lawmakers have warned about Hezbollah's supposed reach posing a security threat.
Hezbollah is a menace to the Lebanese state, the Lebanese people, and the entire region.
Hezbollah is not a political party, it's not a quaint reflection of history. It's a web of terrorists and criminals, and that web extends here to our hemisphere.
They've certainly had their successes of big ticket bombings,
including the U.S. Embassy in Beirut and the Israeli Embassy in Argentina. Hezbollah has operated in South America for decades and now blending into Shia Muslim communities in Mexico, including Tijuana. Other pockets along the Mexican-U.S. border remain largely unidentified as U.S. intelligence agencies are focused on the drug trade.
Ultimately, the nexus between drugs and terrorism originates in our hemisphere, and U.S. officials must be more proactive in fighting it.
The threat from these transnational crime organizations includes the actual sale and distribution of raw cocaine. We know that these transnational crime organizations break down this raw cocaine and cut it to be sold in larger quantities in the United States. So the key for us is to be out in front in the traffic zone, detect, monitor, and then interdict this cocaine before it ever gets to the distribution point.
Our work today to identify these threats and develop strategies to counter them is of great interest to my colleagues in the Congress. Reports from today's proceedings will be provided to the Armed Services Committee, upon which I serve, to the Judiciary Committee, which maintains jurisdiction over the Drug Enforcement Agency, upon which I serve. Also, members from the Appropriations, Financial Services, and Foreign Affairs Committees have expressed interest in our work and will be receiving a report. In addition to our presenting witnesses today who are experts in their respective areas, I've invited to join me leaders from our local community to participate in this endeavor. And there's a specific reason for that. As we'll learn from our witnesses, the way that webs of terror and narcotics trafficking and money laundering are able to prosper rely upon weak local government institutions. And the areas of the world that don't have strong interconnectivity of their local governments end up being the areas where so many of our adversaries take hold. And so that's why it's important not only to understand what's going on at the strategic level, but also to understand how our local partners can develop even more competencies and coordination to meet this growing threat. And so to that end, I'm very grateful to have with us, I'll start on my right, Commissioner Bob Cole from Santa Rosa County, Mayor Ashton Hayward. Mayor, thanks for having us here in Pensacola. Always a pleasure. My good friend Sheriff Mike Atkinson from Walton County. We've got Dick Ranierson, the mayor of Fort Walton Beach. Graham Fountain, who's still in my phone as Colonel Graham Fountain, though he's currently a county commissioner in Okaloosa County, served in a variety of law enforcement capacities at the state and local level. And we also have Commissioner Burgash, from Escambia County here joining us, and I see my tax collector, Ben Anderson, as well from Okaloosa County. Thank you for being here. We also have with us from the Escambia County Sheriff's Office, Chief Deputy Chip Simmons, and from the Santa Rosa Sheriff's Office, Captain Doug Brinkmans, and from the First Judicial Circuit State Attorney's Office, John Molchan. So thank you all so much for being here and being a part of this endeavor. America continues to be engaged in flashpoints all around the world. Counterterrorism in Afghanistan, counterinsurgency in Yemen, train and equip missions in Africa, deconfliction in Syria, deterrence in Europe, and a nuclear standoff on the Korean Peninsula. Northwest Floridians are making contributions all over the world in these areas. But with so much happening in so many places, it would be easy to look beyond the challenges that we face here in Latin America, right at the doorstep of Florida. We hold this field hearing to highlight the priority of a stable Western Hemisphere and to discuss countermeasures to the rise of drug cartels, traffickers, money launderers, and radical Islamic extremism in our hemispheric neighborhood. I'll start with a discussion of Iran. We cannot ignore Latin America because our adversaries are not ignoring Latin America. Iran in particular sees investments in Latin America as a strategic platform to launder hundreds of millions of dollars, to build markets for trafficking cocaine and heroin, to generate cash flow for terrorism, to recruit and train terrorists, and to expand the dangerous ideology of political Islam. Iran operates in the Western Hemisphere primarily through its terror proxy, Hezbollah. In fact, I was surprised to learn that there are more Lebanese Hezbollah in Latin America today than there are in Lebanon. Iran leverages this diaspora to enhance its operational capability, to gain political influence among Latin American nations as well. Iran and Hezbollah have a history of planning and conducting terrorist attacks in the Western Hemisphere. A plot to blow up the JFK airport, the attempted assassination of the Saudi ambassador in Washington, and the bombings at the Israeli embassy and the Israelite Mutual Association in Buenos Aires that you just saw. All of these show troubling trends and capabilities. Joseph Humeyer is here with us today. He is considered one of the foremost experts on Iran's influence in Latin America. Joseph is the executive director of the Center for a Secure and Free Society and is a Marine combat veteran. He will discuss the origin and intention of Iran's malign influence in Latin America and will make policy recommendations in a few moments. To make this investment in the Western Hemisphere profitable, Iran and Hezbollah work alongside and through a number of other global regional criminal enterprises. They include Los Zetas, MS-13, the Sinaloa cartel, and El Golfo cartel. Brave Northwest Floridians are deeply engaged in this fight against destabilizing forces in Latin America. And I want to thank some folks who are here today who serve with the Green Berets in the 7th Special Forces Group. This is mainly the group that has as a principal area of responsibility Latin America here in our hemisphere. Many within the 7th Special Forces Group tell me that they return from Afghanistan, where they're fighting against radical Islamic extremists, to then redeploy to Latin America, where they're still fighting radical Muslim extremists. Joe Callahan formerly served as Sergeant Major with the 7th Special Forces Group and retired as Command Sergeant Major of the Special Operations Command South. He is here today and will discuss with us the impact of the growing crisis in Venezuela, the capabilities of our partner nations, and the areas of progress with our allies in just a moment. Money, drugs, and areas of loose governance and lax enforcement allow our adversaries to flourish in areas in the Western Hemisphere. For example, as the U.S.-Mexico border became porous and penetrable, the Sinaloa cartel and many others moved roughly 80% of the cocaine that makes its way into the United States through the Eastern Pacific on fishing pangas and banana boats, landing those boats in Central America, and then moving the drugs overland over the U.S.-Mexico border into our country. Today, the U.S.-Mexico border is becoming somewhat less attractive of an option due to the Trump administration's focus on border security. Illegal border crossings are down by half. As this has occurred, traffickers and cartels and terrorist organizations are increasingly looking to the Caribbean, to the Gulf of Mexico, and to the Florida Straits as an illicit redevelopment opportunity, harkening back to the days of the 1980s when, at times, a great vast majority of the drugs that entered the United States entered through Florida. We don't want to see that happen again, and in Northwest Florida, we have to plan to be ready. Tim Valenti is here with the Gulf Coast High-Intensity Drug Trafficking Area team, and he will present on the current volume of drug seizures, the importance of local, state, and federal coordination, and the resources that are necessary to get the job done. And Tim, I would note that with the Coast Guard soon to send the Nautilus and the Decisive cutters here in August of 2018, we look forward to Northwest Florida making an even stronger contribution to the fight by hosting even more Homeland Security mission right here in our community. What I'd like to do now is allow each of our witnesses to give an opening statement. They will have extended remarks and recommendations that they'll make in writing to the group. And then after each of our witnesses has made an opening statement, we will then open up for questions that I'll have and that other members of the dais may have about how to combat this threat and how to integrate the assets that we have at the local level. And so, Joseph, I'll recognize you first. Thank you so much for being here and participating in our field hearing.
Thank you, Congressman. Distinguished panel, it's a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you for inviting me to provide you my insight into Hezbollah's gains in South America. Let me begin by giving a little bit of introduction of the work that I've done over the years and also providing an anecdote. Although be it an individual anecdote, it's very symbolic to our policy significance in my policy recommendations towards the threat of Hezbollah in South America. My name is Joseph Humar. I'm the executive director of a think tank in Washington called the Center for a Secure Free Society. Over the last decade, I've been working on issues related to Iran and Hezbollah in Latin America writ large that extends all the way up through, well, I say the Western Hemisphere extends all the way up from Canada down to Argentina. In that time frame, we've seen the threat and the presence, along with their activities, increase by a magnitude of 200%, whether you measure it on the cultural exchange that they've done between Lebanon, Iran, and Latin America, whether it's on the illicit activity, smuggling, trafficking, contraband, or whether it's on Iran's political influence in Latin America, which has expanded, and that's simply measured by the extension of embassies from 6 to 11 in less than half a decade, less than 5 years. One of the most important Hezbollah cases, counterterrorism cases in the world right now, is in the Western Hemisphere. It's in a country that you wouldn't expect. It's not in Venezuela or Bolivia or some of these countries of the tri-border that have a significant presence. It's in a very staunch U.S. ally. It's in Peru. In Peru, an individual suspected of Hezbollah was arrested in 2014, arrested by the Peruvian authorities for potentially being involved in a terrorist plot in that country. The authorities in Peru, the prosecutors in Peru, believe that he was casing a high-profile target. They're not sure what specificity of the target, but it could have been a Jewish entity, much like the Amia bombing in 1994, a U.S. entity, or even a United Nations conference that was being held that same year. The individual was found with over 1,000 pictures of high-value targets and close-order reconnaissance in his possession on his cell phone and tablets. And he was found with nitroglycerin, which is a popular precursor chemical used for explosives, particularly for Hezbollah, for TNT, in his left hand and all throughout his apartment. I served as an expert witness to this trial, which is ongoing. The initial verdict on the trial, which was rendered last April 2017, was a not guilty verdict. The reason that not guilty verdict was extorted on this individual from Hezbollah in Peru was because Peru cannot classify Hezbollah, or just has a legal definition of Hezbollah, as a terrorist organization. To put it very simply, if we were to call our counterparts in Peru, and this is significant of all the countries in Latin America, because no country has designated Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. But if we were to call our counterparts in Peru and ask, are there any operational Islamic terror organizations in your country? They would say no. If we were not satisfied with that answer, we would call again and say, is Hezbollah operating in your country? They would say yes. The reason you have the variance in that answer is because no Latin American country, Peru included, classifies Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. Therefore, this individual, since he did not successfully carry out a terrorist act, was found not guilty. Through the work of the FBI, the U.S. Embassy, my participation in the case, and others, the Supreme Court of Peru has overruled the federal court's ruling and has decided to reopen the case, and it will be now tried this year in the Peruvian Supreme Court. The reason I focus on this case, the reason I bring it to your attention is because if there is a conviction on this individual for a conspiracy to commit an act of terrorism, that will be the first conviction of a Hezbollah member for a terrorist charge in the history of Latin America. That would be a de facto designation of Hezbollah in the region, not by the United States, but by a partner Latin American nation that could have a legal precedent that's profound throughout the region. But Hezbollah is involved in much more than just terrorism in Latin America. They're also involved in transnational organized crime. If you look at the scale between 2006 and current day, there have been over 540 members on the Department of Treasury's specially designated nationals list that have been designated for involvement in drug trafficking or money laundering or some element of organized crime. That's 46% of that list. 46% of the list that the Treasury has on specially designated nationals belongs to actors or members or affiliates of Hezbollah. Moreover, they've engaged in all kinds of terror plots and terror support activity in the region. So when we talk about a concept that's being increasingly accepted in the Department of Defense and Intelligence Community, the concept of convergence, the crime-terror nexus, the gold standard is Hezbollah. Hezbollah has proven to be adept at being able to multitask and compartmentalize their operations, be it their trafficking operations, their racketeering, their counterfeiting, or their terror support activities. And I think it's most importantly that we define them legally throughout that range. We define them as a terror organization in Latin America. We define them as a transnational criminal organization in the United States. We combine our language so we don't have this miscommunication with our partners in the region. And most importantly, we begin to get the benchmark rights. Some of the critics of this work or of this, some of the things that I've been saying, I've said that whatever we're doing, whatever Hezbollah is doing in Latin America is peripheral to their activity in the Middle East. But that benchmark is incorrect. It's not correct to compare Hezbollah in the Middle East, in Lebanon or Syria or Yemen or Iraq, to Hezbollah in Latin America. The only benchmark that could be accurate is to compare Hezbollah in Latin America today to Hezbollah in Latin America yesterday. And on every indicator and every data point that you look at, that's increasing. And with that, I yield my remarks and look forward to your questions.
Tim, we're going to save you for last. Let's skip over to Sergeant Callahan to give us a perspective from someone who's been in the fight.
Thank you, Mr. Congressman, distinguished panel. Looking at, I think what we should do first is...
If you could get a little closer to the microphone so those behind, they'd have to stare at the back of your head and hear you.
I think what we should do first is take a look at Hezbollah's end state. If you look around the earth, the whole globe, and understand where they are today and how they started, you see an end state. The end state definitely is the occupation of Central South America, pushing up into the United States. When we look at Hezbollah in Latin America, we see a multitude of businessmen. These are legitimate businesses. Until we can prove that the monetary funding line to purchase those businesses was illegal, it's going to be very hard to do what we need to do. What we need to do is obvious. Actually getting the right information is going to be very difficult. That money is either going to come from narcotics trafficking, human trafficking, trafficking of weapon systems, but most importantly, the exchange of tactics, techniques, and procedures to narco-terrorism. These things are used extensively in Mexico right now, and they gain a lot of influence over the government. That in itself is more dangerous than someone establishing a business. And we understand something. Anyone that's connected to Hezbollah that is a businessman is a soldier. All of them are soldiers, as any of them will tell you that. So, understanding what we're facing, the public needs to actually do a little study and understand Hezbollah and its origins. Understand Shia, Sunni, Hamas, things of that nature. Understand who they are, what their goals are, what that means to them, and what the Western world means to them. Thank you.
Thank you. Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Congressman. Distinguished guest. I'm the Executive Director of the Gulf Coast High Intensity Drug Trafficking Areas Program And what we do day in and day out is work with our state and federal and local partners to create initiatives or task forces to enforce the drug laws in the 6 states that I represent, which includes Pensacola. On behalf of our 756 federal, state, and local full-time participants that participate in the Gulf Coast HIDA, it's a real privilege to be here. I will tell you that the hard work of the men and women of all 756 of them, day in and day out, make a difference in every one of our communities throughout our 6 states. Just last year alone, in the Gulf Coast region, we seized over $759 million worth of drugs and seized $34 million of ill-gotten cash. The Gulf Coast HIDA received $8.04 million for every dollar that Congress allotted to the Gulf Coast HIDA through the National HIDA program. The return on investment last year was $92.25. So for every dollar, Congressman, that you gave the Gulf Coast HIDA, we gave you back in drugs and assets and illegal gains $92.25. So I would submit to you that we're making a difference on the Gulf Coast. And what's significant about the Gulf Coast is, and I would agree with you, sir, is that we're tightening the border up, but there's still a lot of drugs that are getting through the border and coming up through the I-10 corridor to your backyard and up toward the East Coast. And we have some other statistics to share with you later on in the program. Thank you.
Great. I'm going to begin, Tim, by asking you to sort of illuminate the ways in which your task force integrates the capabilities that we have at the state and federal and local levels, and how that partnership is working. Are there any additional authorities that are needed? And can you enlighten us on ways in which the current construct has been successful at some of the seizures that you've been able to make?
Absolutely, Congressman. And with the way the Gulf Coast HIDA, and there are 28 HIDAs throughout the country, and the 28 HIDAs touch 49 states, including Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, which basically touches about 60% of the population of this country. Each HIDA group designated area, the Gulf Coast, which we are, like I said, partnerships between our federal partners, state partners, and local partners. I'm the executive director, but I report to an executive board that is made up of 50% of our state and local partners and 50% of our federal partners. Why is that significant? Because our state and local partners, they know what's happening in their area, in the state and local areas. So they have an input on how we spend our $8.4 million in our region. And our federal partners lead a lot of the agencies or the initiatives that we have. But we have also some initiatives, as a task force that is led by a state and local, a local department, depending on the area, depending on the need, and depending on how it was formed.
So leadership is not always federal?
That is correct. That is correct. And that is the beauty part of, I think, and the success of the HIDA program, is that the joint leadership and the same amount of federal and state partners on the executive board making decisions. I have 28 people on our executive board. It's unusual if I don't have at least 26 people at our meetings quarterly to come and give their input and to get the report on what are we doing in the field. So clearly, that is one thing that the HIDA program is doing very, very well, particularly in the Gulf Coast. Our relationship with our federal partners is extremely good, and it goes both ways. So that is one thing we really do well. One of the things, like all agencies, the more money we have, the more partners we can bring in. So, we're in the middle of our budget process that we'll be submitting to the Office of National Drug Control Policy coming up in June. And we have to manage and prioritize the money we have. And what we do in the Gulf Coast is prioritize it by who's performing the best. So as each of our 35 enforcement initiatives are doing their job, we grade them every year and decide on who gets what money and who's doing it has the most profound impact.
Gosh, a few months ago I was with Sheriff Atkinson in Walton County, and we were discussing some of the trends we were seeing in the movement of drugs here. It's no surprise that our community has not been exempt from the challenge that heroin and opioids have presented to us, and we've started to see the drug cartels that we're traditionally familiar with in Latin America working in concert with those who are in the opium trade to realize those synergies. So Joseph or Mr. Callahan, would you like to speak to the extent to which when Sheriff Atkinson or when Tim find cocaine or heroin here in our community, what are some of the assumptions we can draw about the trafficking routes and the coordination that you see between Latin American cartels and Middle Eastern Islamic extremists?
Well, if we first look at the transnational criminal organizations that are supported by Hezbollah, whether they're narco-terrorism, you look at your main players, which are Los Zetas, probably the most sophisticated organization in Mexico, the Sinaloa cartel. These are all soldiers for Hezbollah or Lebanese individuals moving narcotics. When Hezbollah began to move into Mexico, they realized that this is a cash cow. Human trafficking is a cash cow. Narcotics is a cash cow. What you will find that they did, the war that existed between Los Zetas, Sinaloa cartel, Beltran Leyva, was disorganized. What Hezbollah has done was organize these individuals into solid corridors to move narcotics into the United States. These corridors function extremely well now, very well organized, and that's something that Hezbollah does very well. They organize very, very well. Once we begin to tighten up our border in Arizona, Mexico, California, you will start to see, as you mentioned, Congressman, you will start to see the Caribbean become more of an asset to them. Not anything other than like the days of Carlos Later. We got Carlos Later, he gave us other individuals once he was indicted, which led to Noriega in his fall, which led to Pablo Escobar in his fall. But the Caribbean will be the next field that they'll move into, begin moving narcotics into this area. If you take 20 boats as was practiced in the 80s, and 3 of those boats get through, those 3 boats will pay for the others that were captured. And that's definitely what I believe and some others believe is going to start happening.
I was recently in Colombia and Peru, met with the presidents of those countries and some of their high-end drug interdiction assets. And one thing that they stressed to me was that the coordination between U.S. law enforcement and law enforcement in Latin America was critical, not just from a military to military standpoint, but actually bringing law enforcement assets from Peru and Colombia into Miami, into Tampa, and then training and coordinating and collaborating on tactics. They are hopeful that those efforts will continue. You've seen it on the military side. Can you speak at all to the importance of ensuring that those partner nations are as capable as possible so that we're not having to sacrifice our armed service members and our treasure to go and fight this threat exclusively?
Yes, sir. Again, if we back up a little bit, our problem started in 2000 when we gave up the Panama Canal. We gave up an entire brigade of soldiers that stabilized that region, that fostered those relationships in Central South America. At one time, not just the 7th Special Forces Group, but the other military personnel, Air Force, Navy, Marines, stabilized that entire region. We almost controlled, to a T, what was happening down there, just because of our relationships with those governments. Once we left, we began to see a major influx of Chinese, a major influx of Lebanese. We've seen the tri-border area grow substantially with...
When you say the tri-border area, everyone may not be familiar with that. Will you define that for us?
Yes, sir. Tri-border area, we look at Colombia, which is really what you want to focus on. Other countries in and around Colombia we call it tri-border area. Paraguay, if you can reach down into Uruguay, they're also major players. Countries like that. There has always been Argentina, there's always been a Lebanese community. But predominantly 30 years ago, that was Christian. Today, that is not Christian. These are hardcore Islamists. They control it. If you look into Panama, what the Panama Free Zone was at one time, Christian Lebanese and mostly Jewish businessmen control that merchandise. Today, take another look. You will not find that many Jewish businesses existing anymore. But you will see one of the largest expansions of Lebanese neighborhoods throughout Panama, one of the largest we have.
I didn't realize before I was elected to Congress how extensive the Lebanese diaspora was in our hemisphere. I am shocked to learn of its reach. Joseph, one of the things, if you take as a standard the law enforcement to law enforcement cooperation, I was wondering, reading through your book, is there a way to extend that to other type of governmental services and assets? For example, I have my tax collector here. He knows when something's fishy with a local business because his team is there engaging in business licensure, tax collection, and there's an intimacy of that relationship that of course will be stronger than we'll have in Washington or even at the state level. Do you think that there's promise from a policy standpoint in including in some of these trips that members of Congress take to the region, people from local government who can help, develop capabilities for local governments in Latin America to use technology better and to have a better understanding of what's going on in these businesses? And then maybe can you also, in answering that question, tell the story of how, when you're in the tri-border region of Argentina, for example, and you see a computer repair shop or a mechanic shop, that might not be what you're actually looking at.
Absolutely. Congressman, let me contextualize this by saying that in Latin America, at this current stage, we're in a battle for legitimacy. It's a battle that's being fought on many playing fields in the commercial, economic, diplomatic, political, even in the military sphere. But at the center of gravity in this battle for legitimacy are a handful of countries. A handful of countries that have worked in aggressively over the last decade, arguably more, to actually take away U.S. legitimacy in a systematic and concerted fashion. Those collection of countries have a name. They're called the Bolivarian Alliance of the Americas. It's a collection of 9 countries, but principally 6 that are major states. There's some Caribbean satellites. Iran, China.
Go ahead and name the member nations of the Bolivarian Alliance.
Well, outside of the Caribbean satellites, the principal members are Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Ecuador, and El Salvador, and Cuba. And then there's, like I said, Dominica, St. Kitts, and some other Caribbean countries that belong part of that alliance. That alliance, which was essentially Hugo Chavez's legacy project, was designed to offset U.S. influence. This is the reason why they booted out our Drug Enforcement Administration and their embassies, the reason why they shut down forward operating locations in bases such as Manta in Ecuador. It's the reason that the U.S. got significant diminished presence in certain countries in the region. Now, it had its ebbs and flows, and it had its high water mark, I'd say, around 2012. Right before Hugo Chavez died. But what the work that was done between 2004, when it was inaugurated, to 2012, was capitalized on by Iran, Russia, and China. Now, these collection of countries have basically come into Latin America, and they've used a different framework. And we don't recognize that framework because we tend to run away from corruption. Being the United States, we try to work with our partners and have them help them curb their corruption. But these countries have been able to run towards corruption. And so they've worked with transnational criminal organized groups, they've worked with terrorist groups, and they work with a variety of non-state actors to basically legitimize their presence and control territory. It's a different kind of legal construct. In Venezuela, they don't look at drug trafficking the same way we do here in the United States. And so they codify it legally in a very different way that allows them to move products and material all throughout the region. Why this is important is because the earlier question that you gave to the panel, Congressman, you talked about the opioid crisis, the cocaine movement. Well, if we talk about distribution networks that Los Zetas and other cartels have been able to penetrate into the United States have been aided and abetted by certain governments, Venezuela being the most prominent. Venezuela has aided and abetted probably every cartel in Latin America over the last decade to be able to push trafficking corridors through the Caribbean and through land-based corridors in Central America into Mexico, into the United States. Those distribution networks, if you get into the granularity and specificity of the networks, dovetail with Hezbollah. And I think that's at the point, that's at the crossroads where we have to begin to look. Tri-border areas were the origin of it. States, state sponsors of transnational criminal activity are now the evolution of that. The control of territories is fundamental to this problem set, and I think if we lose territory because certain actors and countries in Latin America will try to push us out, this problem is going to get much worse.
And so can we enhance that connectivity by having more gov-to-gov relations, not at the federal level, but at the local level?
We do. I think there's certain programs such as the National Guard does in countries like Salvador, in Colombia, in Peru. I think law enforcement has some programs as well that they do bilateral training, and I think those are very significant. But like anything else, an action is only as good as the narrative. And if the narrative isn't structured around U.S. cooperation in Latin America, the message doesn't reach everybody. It stays within pockets of law enforcement or military or otherwise. The key to making this work is to tell the story right. The U.S. needs to have a narrative that goes to Latin America that shows once again that we care about the region, that the region is prominent and important to us. And that narrative needs to be echoed all throughout different spheres of government, but also outside the government and civil society. I think there's a lot of cooperation happening at the command level. I know Southcom does a lot of mil-to-mil cooperation, Unitas, Panamex, New Horizons. But these narratives, these stories aren't told about what we do for the region. We are still the prominent partner to Latin America. That's not going away. The Chinese do not do more military or law enforcement cooperation, but they tell a better story.
Commissioner Fountain?
Thank you, Congressman Gates. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. Joseph, if you would, you're hitting on something that I experienced on my last trip to South America in Venezuela, and we were there on two state visits actually with Governor Bush and some law enforcement officials. And several of the states wanted us to come to actually, it was a two-part, part educational to train them about working commercial vehicles for drug smuggling and terrorism and bombs and WMDs and also human trafficking. But on the same token, we were very oppressed by what we could do, where we could go. And I was very surprised to notice that Chavez had basically taken over the autopista, or the state highway in Aragua, and stationed the Guardia Nacional there to do the pre-collection, as we called it, or they called it, of the toll booths. We also saw their guys stationed at the money cash exchange businesses, and they were charging fees for people to go in and exchange money. And they were armed with machine guns and shotguns, so that he was definitely collecting money. Some of the people that we met in local law enforcement were involved in a subsequent coup and are no longer with us today. We were not invited back, as you can imagine, because things really went terrible. But as it got to a point, say in Venezuela, is Hezbollah and the terrorists, are they very much publicly embedded into the Guardia Nacional now? You know, people tend to think local law enforcement are corrupt ones in a lot of those countries, but what I saw was just the opposite. We had city and state police officials that were not, and the federales were. So what's that look like today?
Thank you for the question, Commissioner. And I think it depends on which country you're talking about. If we were to segment Latin America into 3 different blocks, I think you would use one block that would be considered fully co-opted countries, meaning countries that are fully co-opted by Iran or Hezbollah. Those include Venezuela, Bolivia, some of the countries I mentioned in the Bolivarian Alliance. Then you have partly co-opted countries, meaning that the Hezbollah Iran has been able to advance in certain segments of society and penetrate certain elements of government, but not the government writ large and not the country as a whole. And then I would call resistant countries, countries that are actively fighting against Hezbollah in their country. I would include Argentina on that list, Colombia, Peru, increasingly Panama. And these countries are our partners. This is our ability to come into Latin America and work at the political level all the way down to the tactical level and to get a full level of cooperation. So there's an ebb and flight. Venezuela, you mentioned. Venezuela is, I consider, a non-permissive environment for the U.S. It's very difficult to operate at any level, even outside of the government, on a media, on a civil society level in that country, because they control pretty much every aspect of their society. And Hezbollah has been able to gain influence in Venezuela because, not just because of the ability that the Venezuelan government has provided them, the platform that they provided them to come in, but also because there's a historic linkage in Venezuela, a migration linkage between Lebanon, Syria, and that country. This predates the origin of Hezbollah. You know, we talk about the numbers in Brazil and other places of more Lebanese in Latin America than in Lebanon. But one of the most significant numbers I think that everyone should be aware is that in Venezuela, there's over 350,000 Syrian or Lebanese expatriates, that many of which hold high offices and positions of power in the governorships, mayorships, at the local level. Equally, in Syria, in one city in Syria, in southwestern Syria, there's 350,000 Venezuelans in Syria that are Spanish-speaking dual citizens between Venezuela and Syria. There's been a bridge developed between these two countries that have we've been able to use Venezuela as a launching pad for other operations in Latin America. If you look at how Iran's taken over the Levant and created the land bridge through Syria into Lebanon, well, the air bridge is extended to Venezuela, which has given them the platform. So migration usually is followed by money. Money is usually followed by nefarious actors, and that activity has grown, which I re-emphasize that Venezuela is very much the gateway for.
Thank you. Thank you for the comments. Thank you, Congressman.
Sheriff Atkins? I want to touch on something I believe I heard Command Sergeant Major Cullen say a minute ago, which is what I see, and part of this is sometimes when you seek a maximized solution to a single issue, you have a system disruption on the other thing. Other things stop working. So if you solve just border security, you have that issue. If you don't deal with the financial issue, that becomes an issue. And it takes a strategic, holistic approach to have impact. That's kind of my takeaway. I believe what I heard you say in part. The second part of, I guess, a question is, if I'm hearing this correctly, has to do with something I've heard economist Rachel Motzman talk about some, which is a currency of trust. And so what's happening is with this funding from Hezbollah, the proxy of Iran, develops this trust relationship inside these communities that becomes the breeding ground. So you end up with Sinaloa folks all the way down to street-level drug dealers in Walton and Okaloosa County, or North Florida, if you will, becoming proxy Islamists, whether they realize that or not. That by investing in these communities, building this relationship in Central America, that is effectively what's happening. Am I saying that correct? That by not taking a strategic approach, that's what we're seeing? That's correct.
And Tim, would you speak to that as well? The Sheriff's question about kind of the downstream consequence, and particularly as it relates to volume. You'd indicated that you had some data on the volume. I think that would be very responsive to the Sheriff's question.
Yes, sir. And Sheriff, one of the things I would explain to you is that we run a watch center, our Department of Homeland Security Blue Light and Operation Gulf Coast Haida Watch Center, which is a 24/7 operation that responds to inquiries from enforcement officers out on the highways, on I-10, 20, 40, 65, to give and search indices to try to give them information back on potential stop, to give them probable cause to make an arrest and or continue to a seizure. What's happening on that information, because it's so timely with the Supreme Court ruling and such, there's a short period of time that those officers only have, and the Watch Center responds to those inquiries, tries to make connections to drug trafficking and human trafficking as well. And what happens is that information is very helpful for those officers on the highway. But if a seizure is made or an arrest is made, what's happening is we're doing a post-seizure analysis where we're showing drug trafficker A is connected to drug trafficker B, who's connected to somewhere in Mexico or maybe South America, and show the different residences and show those connections and the concealment methods. And we're sending that back to the southwest border, our partners at the CBP, and they're utilizing that information on a daily basis so that we can stay current on the border and to try to keep as much of that out, and when tightening the border is obviously having an impact. As it relates to seizures, what it is, in 2017, from our domestic highway through our Gulf Coast Watch Center, there were 643 seizures made along the interstates that we patrol. Of that, there was 51 pounds of fentanyl seized in 2017. That could easily account for 50,000 overdoses in the opioid crisis, easily. So we're making an impact, and we're utilizing that information to make a difference. We just did there was a stop made of some drugs going toward the East Coast, and after the post-seizure analysis, there was a connection made to another vehicle. 2 weeks later, the vehicle was a different vehicle, and that same organization was coming back on the eastbound side, back toward the southwest border. And a stop was made and ultimately led to an arrest and seizure of over $256,000 just from a post-seizure analysis. So working that information and that intelligence is making a difference and sending that back to the border. And it's even going further south than just our border, and it's being shared with our counterparts in South America.
HIDA continues to be a valued resource for us. There's no question about that. One thing that does concern me, and I would ask if you wouldn't just touch on this, there's still I think a legitimate concern among local law enforcement about disparate databases, i.e. who is having access to what information, or to put it bluntly or plainly, does the left hand know what the right hand's doing in regard to all of this information that we come in contact with, and you, from a military standpoint, there are so many sources of intake, and there seems to be disparate databases that we think should be, and I see the command sergeant maybe smile because he understands what I'm saying, is the integration of this. I think it's going to be crucial for us to be successful as we morph into both from money laundering, things of that nature. We need to be able to speak to each other.
Yeah, when General Kelly sounded the alarm, basically on the presence of Hezbollah lining themselves up with narco-traffickers, that became a major issue in 2012. It was huge. Since then, we've pretty much confirmed that is happening. One of the major, already known and recognized drug dealers in Venezuela, Walid Garcia, he is Hezbollah. He's already been targeted as a narco-trafficker. We know that he has direct connection to Loseta organization. We know Loseta organization moves his narcotics. They've now got into the narcotics game. If you look how smart Losetas is, in 2012, during one of our trips into Mexico, Losetas had come up with a plan to inundate Europe with cocaine to replace the drug of choice being heroin. They moved into Western Africa, moving up the rat lines, which are just secure lines controlled by Islamists, and do that. Now, for the United States, now you have Mexico producing its own heroin. They cut Peru out. With that being said, their plan was now to inundate the United States with good heroin, what they call good heroin. So very smart, very fluid. If we look at what's happening now, all of our federal agencies are trying to get a new foothold on Latin America. We took our eye off of it for about 10 years. In those 10 years, things have gotten pretty bad. So as the agency gets a new foothold, the DEA gets a new foothold, the Department of Homeland Defense, there is no fusion center set up to receive that critical information on informants in Latin America. I know that for a fact. Until that's done, here in Florida, you won't be able to initiate any type of response on the waterways in order to interdict, unless you understand exactly who the key players are now.
Sheriff, if I could address your comments as well. At the Watts Center, we have began meetings, regular scheduled meetings to share intelligence with all of our federal counterparts, to include the FBI, the DEA, Homeland Security, CBP. The National Guard is embedded at the Watts Center. So while we're not perfect at sharing information, but actually the President's Commission, led by Governor Christie, acknowledged that the HIDA program does an excellent job of sharing information. So we're not perfect at it, but we're certainly trying to work through that and to share that information to make an impact in our communities.
To be clear, I wasn't actually speaking about HIDA. I think you guys do an excellent job. I meant just across the system of law enforcement and other government entities.
Yeah, and to elaborate on that, remember, when we start off in Latin America, we start with sources. We start with specific individuals that give us information on specific initiatives of moving narcotics or human trafficking or trafficking weapons. Unless those sources are revealed to federal agencies, nothing's going to happen. So one way or another, there has to be a fusion center set up in order to bring all those sources, give those sources, give the federal agencies, get with Florida, if you will, like this is what's happening, these are the key players, and that's when HIDA gets the current information on where things are moving from.
Mayor, thank you, Congressman Gates. I want to welcome everyone. It's always great to be out this incredible museum, and I want to thank everyone for being in our great city of Pensacola. And Congressman Gates, thanks for bringing this subject up. I just want to ask, it seems like the overarching theme that we're talking about is really vulnerability. And if you think about, globalization really hitting America upside the head in 2000 and 2001 with 9/11, and everything that's going on with cybersecurity today, and we're talking about the drug trafficking and the money coming up into the United States, with Hezbollah being in South and Central America and creating these caliphates, if you will. I mean, how vulnerable do you think we are? Because I know everyone's sitting up here, and Congressman Gates representing Northwest Florida. because public safety is the number one thing for me, obviously, when it comes to being the mayor, but we're talking about a big issue when it comes to terrorism and how that really can affect small towns in America, because it sounds like what we're hearing is how smart these folks are in penetrating these small towns in America so they can, you know, potentially have an action, if you will. And what are we doing, and have you seen that in small towns, especially the 1.5 million people in Northwest Florida, which is just really a big city west of Tallahassee? Have y'all seen any kind of action happening up here in Northwest Florida? Because I think that's one of the things that we're concerned about on what you're seeing on a big scale. And again, I want to thank the panel for being here. I know that's a loaded question.
Yeah, Mr. Humar, why don't you start with that in terms of you know, framing up the extent to which, particularly from a state actor standpoint, Iran views Latin America as a strategic platform to do just what the mayor is concerned about and potentially bring violence to our community.
And I'll quantify that. I lived in Manhattan on 9/11, so I was right there when we were attacked, right in the city, and I watched the whole thing. So that's going to be coming up on 17 years, and we talk about this, but the small towns, and Congressman Gage touched on it in South America, seeing these storefronts that look like a phone arcade or a computer store. I mean, the money laundering, all these things, they happen in small towns with one intention, is to do what they did 17 years ago.
No, absolutely, Your Mayor. And if I can, I'll touch a little bit on the sheriff's comments as well, because I think you're talking about the same theme fundamentally of what's going on in Latin America, vulnerability and essentially ungoverned areas in the region. And I want to provide a little context towards that word. I don't believe there's any part of Latin America that's ungoverned. There's certain parts of Latin America that are stateless. The state doesn't have a heavy presence, but everything has a governance structure, even if that governance structure is outside of the state. Cartels and criminal organizations, they thrive on the state having less and less control over certain parts of their countries, where they come in and they become de facto governors, mayors, and other places, providing public services and works even to the citizens and the constituents of that part of that country. Hezbollah understands this very well. They operate very much the same way in Lebanon. And what you see is in Latin America is you see a struggle between criminal enterprise and free enterprise. So we here in the United States try to push for more free enterprise and to have that opportunities abundant throughout our states and our local cities throughout the country. In Latin America, where that's deficient, you see criminal enterprise take over. The more criminal enterprise outpaces free enterprise in Latin America, the more vulnerable we become here in the United States, because the migration continues to move up. Both the formal migration, but also the illegal migration, and more importantly, the mass migration that could be looking when you get to situations such as Venezuela. Venezuela, it has to be a wake-up call for everyone in this country, particularly in Florida, because the refugee crisis that's exacerbating in that country is going to affect all of us. It's a very Syria-esque like refugee crisis, with over 1 million refugees flooding out of that country right now into neighboring countries such as Colombia and Brazil. But eventually, as they can't contain those refugees, that's going to move further north into Central America, Mexico, the Caribbean, and then eventually into our country. Venezuela is already the #1 country in the United States for asylum cases. So those are usually folks that land here through plane and then seek asylum. And in general, I think what we see when we look at the push-pull factors of migration and refugees and economic calamities, we have to look at Hezbollah and Iran. If you look at the history of Hezbollah Iran, they are masters of clandestine network design and masters of manipulating refugee movements to be able to get their agents and subversives in and out of different regions. When you move a terrorist, you just need a simple, one corridor that you can use, and you can use that to move individuals. When you move mass amounts of people, you use humanitarian aid, refugee networks, and that's what's happened. That's how this network was set up in Latin America. If you look at the tri-border area in South America, which is the crossroads of Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay, that tri-border area was set up by the same network of the original tri-border in southern Syria, northern Israel, and southern Lebanon, which has now become Hezbollah-controlled territory, at least in the southern Lebanon portion. They replicated that tri-border in South America, South and South America, and now created other tri-borders, northern Peru, southern Peru, northern Chile, western Bolivia, another tri-border, Colombia, Brazil, and Peru. So they use these crossroads because they use it as a network designed to move not just terrorists, but all kinds of subversive actors that create and capitalize on the stateless areas in Latin America, and that's going to become a problem for, and I think that's what General Kelly was referring to when he started looking at all these different threat streams. And I think Southcom has some of the best work on this when you look at not compartmentalizing criminal groups, terrorist groups, and others, but just calling them threat networks. Just putting it all together, calling them threat networks, and how are these threat networks moving, how are they getting financed, and how are they converging? And that's, I think, eventuality going to be our challenge.
But if you carry that to its next logical place, I think the mayor's question is, at its highest risk point, what does that really mean for us? Does this mean that we're facing our highest risk today with the movement of drugs? Does it mean that we could face a risk like an asymmetric threat, like we saw on 9/11? Or does it mean we could see hardened Iranian military assets in Latin America? For example, in Venezuela, where you've got investments from the Iranian Navy, such that it is, right here in our hemisphere. So I guess walk through the types of threats, the types of challenges we could face if the Congress were to ignore the problem.
Right now, Congressman, we're already facing an asymmetric threat. We're already facing a threat that involves drug trafficking, it involves information operations, cyber operations, it involves manipulation of refugee and migration networks. If we let this continue to its natural direction, we're going to also face conventional threats, meaning we're going to face Iranian military pre-positioning themselves in forward operating areas in South America. They already have a significant Iranian military presence in 2 countries, in Venezuela and Bolivia. If we continue to neglect this issue, you're going to see Iranian military presence in other countries further north. Most notably, I look at Nicaragua. This natural evolution of Iran's presence is very similar to how they operated in the Middle East. You know, Iran took certain elements that were fragmented in vulnerable elements within different societies throughout the Middle East, and they consolidated them among the Iranian Revolution. That's how they've been able to control the Levant. This extends from Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, increasingly Yemen, increasingly Bahrain, and now including Turkey. That same methods and tactics and training and protocols that they use in the Middle East, they've exported to Latin America.
That's a key point. That's a key point that I had not picked up until I spent some time with our folks at 7th Special Forces Group, that the lessons learned on the battlefield in Syria and in Lebanon are actually being used in Central and South America to destabilize governments and then potentially attack the United States. It's a point worth underscoring it. You also made mention to me in one of our private meetings, you said, Congressman, Venezuela isn't like Syria. Venezuela is Syria. And that many of the same governmental failures and then movements of humans and drugs and money we're seeing. Can you further illuminate on that? And then I'd love to hear Mr. Callahan express sort of from the tactical level whether he agrees with that strategic assessment.
Historically, Venezuela and Syria have evolved in a very commensurate rate in terms of their movement of different territorial control over their countries, using that military insurgencies to capture those countries and then using that country to capture the regions. In Venezuela, the prominence of specific Arabs in that country has risen to a level that's hit the highest levels of government. Currently, as we speak today, the vice president of Venezuela is a ethnic Syrian Lebanese, meaning his mother's from Lebanon and his father's from Syria. He's an individual who's been designated by the Treasury Department as a drug trafficker, money launderer. He's also an individual that's been an entity of concern for many elements of the intelligence community. If you look at his specific rise to prominence in Venezuela, it was not by accident. His father before him was very close to the revolutionary networks that operated in Venezuela that were in connection to the FARC in Colombia. His grandfather before him was involved in some of the most prominent communist clandestine operations in Venezuela in the 1960s. His grandfather, or great-grandfather, was involved in the Arab revolt in Syria. These are revolutionary networks that extend throughout the histories of both regions and have created a trans-regional network to be able to communicate. Not too long ago, in a congressional hearing that I testified in, we spoke a lot about an air link between Venezuela, Syria, and Iran. It was a flight that was a code share between Iran Air, Iran's national airline, and Conviasa, which is Venezuela's national airline. This flight was a weekly flight, as with stopovers in Damascus and Tehran, and it was completely unavailable to the commercial public in Venezuela. More to the point, it was unavailable to our intelligence community, who had very little access to that flight, which was shielded by both governments, all three governments, the Syrian government, Venezuelan government, and Iranian government. And I believe that flight was one logistical element that helped build this bridge between the two countries. The two countries have more in common than what we see with just specific political relations between the three countries. I believe there's a historic, ethnic connection between these three countries. And if we don't understand that historic connection, we will continue to see this problem get worse.
Are there other questions? Commissioner Cole.
Thank you. Congressman, thanks for the invitation. And when I was first invited to this as a county commissioner, I thought, well, what's Hezbollah in the Western Hemisphere have to do with filling potholes or taking care of drainage ditches? But it goes right back to what Sergeant Major said. It's all about public understanding. I didn't understand how deeply rooted this was until I started going on Google and look at things. And I'm glad that I took the time to do that. So how do we inform the American public without getting oversensitized and without panicking the American public? Because when you start looking at our opioid addiction in this country today, when you look at the fact that you and I may go home tonight and sit and watch television or go to a big box store or have dinner with our wives or husbands and do those things that Americans have become used to doing over all these years, and know for a fact, after looking at this, that there's an enemy out there. There's no better way to call them other than an enemy that wants to see nothing more than the destruction of this country through any means they can provide. They're making weapons, the cocaine, the human trafficking. My concern after hearing the last statement about the Iranian presence in that country is with their nuclear program. You know, here we have the Koreans trying to launch long-range nuclear capability, and we're going to have it sitting at our doorstep with an enemy that can bring a dirty bomb across the border. So it's quite frankly, it's frightening. When you bring it down to the level that most Americans are at, as far as the communication, as far as the understanding of what's going on, and then step it up a degree, it becomes very frightening. I'm glad there's organizations like you gentlemen represent out there. I'm very glad there's our military out there and law enforcement agencies. That's probably the only reason I'll sleep better tonight. But how do we get that information out there? How do we make it more known to the general public that this is real? This isn't just a TV show tomorrow night that's going to be on the Grammys next year. This is a real factual problem that we're facing with an enemy that wants to step all over us.
Elaborate what Joseph said. Tariq Assami, being from a very prominent family in Lebanon, he is the vice president of Venezuela. He is Lebanese, he is Hezbollah. When he moves into the presidential seat, he'll bring in another Lebanese. There's no doubt about that. You'll see a swift change in Venezuela's military foothold in its own region. You'll see that, and I predict if it continues, you'll see an Islamic State rise out of Venezuela. A great part of Maracaibo now is Islam. There are...
Say that again. I mean, that is so worth repeating. You believe, given the current likelihood of succession of the potential vice president of Venezuela to the presidency, that we could see an Islamic State in Venezuela right here in our hemisphere, in our lifetimes?
If it continues like it is, yes. The influence that Iran has over Venezuela, it has a grip that they're not going to get out of for a long time, if they even attempt to get out of it. So as Tariq Assami moves into the presidential position, which I think he will, basically it's a movement he'll make. He'll bring in a vice president that is Lebanese, and then you'll see a big shift.
Congressman, can I ask one just follow up very shortly?
Sure, and then we'll go to Commissioner Burgash and then Sheriff Atkins.
For Command Sergeant Major Callahan, are they already doing Sharia courts there now?
There are Sharia courts there. Now, understand, not 30 years ago, Venezuela was one of our preferred military training partners. Venezuela, what Colombia is today, Venezuela was 30 years ago. I trained Venezuelans. There was no hint of any type of radical Hezbollah or Lebanese factions at that time that we could see. we pretty much had a good relationship with the country. But in the last 10 years, just 10 years, you see major mass migrations, like Joseph said, of Iranians moving into the area. And it's only getting stronger.
Mr. Ragash?
Well, first and foremost, I want to thank Congressman Gates for organizing this and inviting us, we elected officials here. And at first I felt like you, Commissioner Cole, I was over here saying, well, this is going to be an interesting thing and I'm just going to sit and listen. But the more I hear, the more concerned I get. I spent 10 years on the school board before I became a county commissioner. And I would say in our communities, certain segments of our community, drugs are the #1 issue. And primarily, it was marijuana, but now we're seeing more of the heroin. And I hear one of the panelists say that now they're cultivating it in Mexico and bringing it right over. So I appreciate the efforts here that we're doing to hear about all these things. And the question I have is, and I always bring this up, when I was on the school board and we would kick out 10, 15, 20 kids every month for bringing drugs to school or doing drugs, we eventually got those numbers down. But there's a segment of the population who will look you in the eye and say, look, this war on drugs, it's not winning. We're not winning it and it's not worth it. I think what you're doing is vitally important. When I hear about the 10 years that you guys took off and how much damage that's done, not being there, that concerns me. But I'd like to hear from the experts. What would you say to the people that are very, very naive and that believe that a war on drug is futile? I'd really like to hear that.
So the war on drugs, beginning in 1987, more or less, give or take a few years, Plan Colombia was just that, a war on drugs. If you listen to some of the DEA, read the DEA reports, if you talk to some of the older SF guys that have retired out of the 7th group, have we made much of a difference? No. Spray planes did a great job, but it was rotational. Narcotics are narcotics, and they're going to grow, and it's going to happen. I can't sit here and say we made a big dent in it, but I do know that Colombia is more aggressive against it now that we've professionalized their military than they ever have been. I mean, they are good partners in counter-drug operations. That doesn't stop the FARC or the ELN from transporting it or assisting in it, but now you have another player, you have Mexico. Much stronger, much smarter, more closer, and they are more fluid, and now they get assistance from Hezbollah, one of the great organizers in the Middle East and in Latin America. The United States is a cash cow. The cash cow are the children using drugs. The cash cow are moving illegals into the United States. The cash cow are selling weapons on the streets. California, Texas, places like that, from MS-13. I don't think you'll ever see a massive attack by Hezbollah in the United States in the near future, only because they don't want to disrupt that cash flow. And that cash flow is pretty good. You can start in Paraguay and you can trace it all the way to Florida. And they are making money.
Chair?
I was just sitting here making notes when you were talking a moment ago. A couple things that kind of grabbed me, and I guess this will be a question. So we're in about year 17 of our war, a formalized war, radical Islam, and I would suggest to you that many people can't tell you the difference between a Shia and a Sunni, certainly as it relates to the successor of Muhammad in the 5th century. But what I find interesting is the Iranian being Shia and the socialism in that area of the world. Is that more specifically a Shia relation to the socialist country, or is it, you see the Wahhabism, the Sunnism? Is there a natural fight for the socialism in Venezuela? Is it strictly Shia moving forward on it?
Thank you for your question, Commissioner, Sheriff. I think what we want to do, and I'm going to use this opportunity also to qualify some of the statements that the Sergeant Major made. The binding element between socialism, communism, and Islamism is two factors. It is nationalism and militarism. Those two binding factors is what unites these elements, because they both consider themselves militant movements and they both consider themselves nationalist sentiment movements.
It's similar to, let's say, like Gamal Nasser or something like that.
Absolutely. So if we look at the Middle East, what defined the 20th century conflicts in the Middle East was the wave of Arab nationalism that took Nasserism to unify, or attempt to unify, the pan-Arab identity between Egypt and Syria. That concept at one point had a title. It was called Greater Syria. It was the unification of the Arab identity. Hugo Chavez took that concept and created it in Latin America and called it Greater Colombia, Gran Colombia. And the idea was to create an Americanist identity that would exclude the United States. So the Americanist identity starts at the Rio Grande and moves south. That concept, that's irregular warfare, that concept, to be able to use that, if you look at what happened in the Middle East, Arab nationalism rose, it fell, and who picked up the pieces? Iran. In Latin America, a very similar trajectory is happening where socialism, or what some have called 21st century socialism, rose for a little bit period where some of these countries started to gain prominence. It's now fallen, as you can see, evident by Venezuela and some of these other countries, and the Bolivarian alliance is politically weaker. Who is going to pick up the pieces? And I think that's the question that we want to ask. The trajectory of what we're seeing in Latin America, if things are course corrected, is that socialism as a concept itself is never going to be that much more popular than it had in its heyday. But there's going to be elements of socialist Islamism combinations that are going to morph and identities that aren't going to be as granular as Shia or Sunni, but are going to take its own identity in the region. And I travel quite a bit to Latin America, and I've spent a lot of time with some of the Islamic communities in Brazil, for instance. And you ask them, you know, are you Shia, Sunni? They don't know the difference either. They're not educated to the granular level of, say, they have in the Middle East. The common defining factor of most of these networks in Latin America is they just consider themselves anti-imperialist. They could be communist one day, Sunni the next day, and Shia the third day. As long as they feel like they're fighting oppression, they carry the flag of what's most popular.
Similar to Hafiz al-Assad being Alawite as opposed to...
Correct, and I just re-emphasize, you know, among the counterterrorism community, this is not a secret that Sunni Salafist elements cooperate with Shia elements. Hezbollah cooperated with Al-Qaeda several times throughout history. Imad al-Muqniyya, one of the most prominent Hezbollah operators who's now deceased, was very active in the tri-border area. He used Sunni elements in there to expand the networks in Latin America. So Iran is very adept at using both, as well, Sunni networks, diasporas, and other communities to be able to preach his message and expand its revolution. So they're not oblivious to the placement of the Sunni networks in the region.
I want to go back to the Colombia-Venezuela balance. I think I heard a collective gasp from our audience when you mentioned the likelihood of Venezuela becoming an Islamic state. Venezuela is currently the only country in Latin America that has the American F-16s. There have been reports that they've given access to those F-16s to Iran and other adversaries of the United States. Our friends in Colombia, when I visited with them, have said they would very much like the authority to buy F-16s in service of Plan Colombia and in service of a balance of power against Venezuela. Is that a request that we should continue to look critically at, look favorably at? What would be your policy recommendations?
I would say that Colombia today is the closest ally we have in Latin America as far as working with us militarily. There's no doubt about that. We professionalized their entire armed services. We built one of the largest special forces organizations in the Colombian military. Right now we could look at them the same way we looked at Venezuela 30 years ago, as a stabilizer within the Latin American region. They're more willing to work with us than anyone else. Honduras also, we have a fairly large air base there that we work out with.
My concern is if the Colombians understand this Venezuelan threat, and I think they do, because they're dealing with the refugee crisis now, and if we don't make the F-16 available to them, they'll go buy another aircraft somewhere else that could potentially have less interoperability with the United States. And to Joseph's point about this is not just sort of a series of tactical decisions. There has to be a broader narrative that we're engaged and invested in the success of Latin America. Do you think that them having access to the F-16 enhances that narrative in addition to sort of the tactical advantage that it could give our Colombian allies?
I do. Right now, Colombia and Venezuela there's always been a certain friction between both countries, always has been. Even more now with the influx of Venezuelans rolling into Colombia through Arauca. It just overran the Arauca province. Even today, Colombia is trying to shut that border down and keep them out. So that friction is growing more and more every day.
What would be your assessment of the F-16 question as it relates to Colombia?
Congressman, I agree with you. I think providing those SSCs in Colombia would be a net positive on behalf of the United States and Colombia. I think it sends a strong signal of cooperation. I think it also allows the Colombians to have a much more significant air fleet to do close order reconnaissance, to do CAS operations, and others. However, I should say that we should also augment our military support through hardware with also training. The Colombians need a lot of training on Iran-Hezbollah. While they're obviously very powerful on understanding insurgencies through the FARC, they're obviously very good at counter-narcotics. I spent a lot of time in Colombia. I worked with their military as well as their police on several occasions. They're not as knowledgeable about Iran and Hezbollah as one would think. And there's a lack of political will, at least in the current administration, to deal with this at the highest levels of the government. Now, there is a Colombian election later this year. I believe it's in May. Now, depending on who wins that election, I think it will provide an opportunity for the United States to engage once again at a very highest level, political level, meaning including the Trump administration with the Colombian administration, to talk about counterterrorism cooperation beyond the FARC, meaning counterterrorism cooperation from foreign terrorist organizations in Latin America. I would like to see Colombia.
A lot of that election, though, really is about the FARC. I've chatted with some of the candidates. One of the candidates, former ambassador of the United States from Colombia, and it seems as though the central question in the current Colombian presidential election is the extent to which to reintegrate the FARC into the political process. Do you believe that Colombia is wise to the threat that Hezbollah poses? I believe Peru is. When I met with the president of Peru, first thing he said when we sat down is, I need help dealing with the rising threat of Hezbollah in my country. Do you think Colombia has that same level of focus?
I believe they're aware of this, and they do a lot of cooperation on the AML and counter-narcotic elements of Hezbollah. They obviously know this when working with their drug cartels in their country to push narcotics abroad. However, as we know, Hezbollah is much more than a drug cartel. They're involved in political operations, information operations, counterterrorism, or terrorism operations, and I don't believe the Colombian government has that level of sophistication on their understanding of Hezbollah writ large, how Hezbollah operates on a societal level. I believe the Colombians need that support. They need that support on many levels. If they're facing a refugee challenge right now, and that's going to define some of this election as well, along with the FARC issue. The more they accept refugees, they cannot fall into the same problem that some of the countries in the Middle East did with Syria, where they don't have the level of counterintelligence to differentiate a legitimate refugee and perhaps a subversive actor that's using the refugee process to be able to get into the country. The rat lines have already been created through the narco-terrorism corridors, through the FARC. Those corridors can easily turn into refugee routes that will be able to export the Venezuelan crisis to other countries in Latin America. I think Colombia is ground zero for that, and we should couch our cooperation on many levels, military cooperation, but also humanitarian assistance with an increase of counterintelligence support.
In the next several weeks, the Congress will put together the omnibus funding bill. And I've learned in my year there that you really seem to get people's attention when you condition money on various acts that you would like to have them do. There's no way to get someone's attention like to withhold their money. For example, with our challenges in Judea and Samaria, we now, as a consequence of the last funding bill, won't fund schools named after terrorists until they change their names. And lo and behold, that can have a positive impact. One suggestion that some of my colleagues have made is that we need to condition aid in Latin America on tangible acts showing a level of seriousness to combat the radical Islamic threat that we face. That can be done in a variety of ways. One would be to designate Hezbollah a terrorist organization. Another way would merely be to be bringing prosecutions as a way to manifest your interest in the issue. Does it run counter to your suggestion that we have to have a narrative of engagement and investment to say we won't make that engagement or investment in the absence of some action against these terrorist threats?
Congressman, I believe that conditioning aid is going to be necessary if we're going to be able to get the most benefits from our support to Latin America. A carrot and stick approach is essentially what's needed. The carrot is obviously the aid, but the stick is the enforcement that if these countries continue to neglect this issue, they continue to turn a blind eye to Hezbollah's activity, they continue to avoid trying to prosecute Hezbollah in their country as a terrorist organization or as a criminal organization, then there will be consequences for that. I think Latin America has gotten away for far too long knowing that this presence is in their country but saying, as one prominent official in a South American country told me, this is not our problem, this is your problem. This is the United States problem. And we know that Hezbollah is here, but they're not targeting our ministries and our government palaces. They're targeting U.S. embassies or Israeli embassies and Jewish centers. So it's really your issue. But until they realize that calculation could quickly change, and this case in Peru, I think, is very prominent in that respect, then conditioning aid would be, I think, a practical way to ensure that we get the most benefit for U.S. national security interests in Latin America.
Mr. Callahan, would you agree with that assessment?
I would. We've done Forces Caminos in Honduras for over 25 years. They're one of our greatest partners now. We rebuilt the entire infrastructure on highways. And it's benefited us with the air base there for over 25 years. So going back in there and offering more, whether it's IMF funding or whether it's more aid for specific initiatives, we can always caveat that.
And you would condition that aid upon real deliverables, whether that's intelligence sharing, designations, prosecutions. You could create a litany of qualifiers, but then they would have to meet those qualifiers to get their aid.
Correct.
Are there other questions from the panel? I have plenty more, but just interrupt me if you've got a question. The United States of America has yet to designate Hezbollah a transnational criminal organization. I believe that we did not do that during the last administration because it could have queered the deal on the JCPOA. Now that we're clear-eyed about the impacts of the Iranian nuclear deal, do you have any suggestions or advice on legislation that I've offered along with Congressman Lee Zeldin of New York to in fact make that designation? And then do you have any view on what ripple effect that could have downrange with our partner nations if we were to take such a bold stand?
Well, look at what we did in the past in the 80s. We indicted Carlos Later. That indictment sent shockwaves through Colombia because he was extradited to the United States. We did the same thing to Pablo Escobar. We did the same thing to Noriega. And this is the only way you're going to create any type of movement within those countries, is if you can identify a specific individual, which we know who these individuals are, indict them, and extradite them to the United States. That sends a clear signal to the community in Lebanon that once we identify these guys, we will bring them to justice.
Mr. Humar, do you have a viewpoint on the transnational criminal organization designation?
I do, Congressman. And as I mentioned in my opening statement, one of the data points that I think was significant in my research was when we started to look at all the individuals that were designated already by Treasury for being drug traffickers or money launderers, it was about 1,100, a little more, that are already designated by Treasury entities, actors, meaning there's individuals, companies on that list. 46% relate to Hezbollah. That means 46% of the people on that list are somehow affiliated to Hezbollah. That means they're already de facto a transnational criminal organization. And then some of those are designated foreign narcotics kingpins. Now I'm going to leave it to my colleagues in government to distinguish between what additional powers labeling Hezbollah transnational criminal organization gives them beyond being already on an especially designated national list or a foreign narcotic kingpin list. But what I'll say is, to the point that I made earlier about the narrative, I think labeling Hezbollah a transnational criminal organization in the United States would extend an olive branch to many countries in Latin America, which will allow them to translate Hezbollah easier in their current legal systems. As I mentioned, we don't have, we would want to have Hezbollah designated as a terrorist organization in all the countries in Latin America. We don't have that yet. We're not even at step one on that. No country designates Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. But I bet to believe that many countries in Latin America would understand that Hezbollah is a transnational criminal organization because they've seen the trafficking, the laundering, the distribution in their countries. Panama, Colombia, or Mexico are prominent in this regard. And if we were to label it as such, they would start to pay attention more to Hezbollah in Latin America. If they pay attention more to Hezbollah in Latin America, they're going to understand that Hezbollah operates beyond just criminal activity, and that could hopefully lead to them designating them as a terrorist organization. The only way this challenge is going to be solved is when we just discard the compartmentalization of the criminal entities and the enforcement measures that are looked at the criminal entities, the terrorist entities and the enforcement measures that are looked at the terrorist entities, and just discard with that lexicon. The convergence is real. Criminal elements and terrorist elements have already worked together, and there's certain terrorist elements that are already involved in a multitude of criminal activity. When we change the lexicon and the perception around that problem set, I think we're going to begin to see some solutions in labeling Hezbollah a transnational criminal organization is a positive step in that direction.
Iran currently funds over 100 cultural centers in Latin America. I have seen reports that those cultural centers recruit human assets, move those human assets to Iran or the Middle East, train them on the battlefield tactics that are employed in the Middle East, and then send them back to Latin America for unknown reasons. What is your assessment of why Iran is investing in over 100 cultural centers in our hemisphere, and are you equally concerned about those cultural centers functioning as recruiting centers for terrorism?
I'm familiar with the cultural centers, the Iranian Shia cultural centers in Latin America, and I should say that they're Iranian funded to some degree, but they're also endogenously funded by local Arab, primarily Syrian Lebanese communities in that country that also provide money to these cultural centers, which gives them an extension to Hezbollah. I believe these cultural centers serve two purposes. There's a dual-use purpose to them, and this is not just my assessment, this was also the assessment of the now deceased prosecutor in Argentina, Alberto Nisman, who prosecuted the Almeida bombing in 1994. One is to serve as a proselytization center, a center to identify displaced and disgruntled populations throughout that country, and to use those displaced and disgruntled populations and to gear them towards the Iranian Revolution, hence the trips to Iran, Qum, and others, Al-Mustafa University, to be able to get that indoctrination. But the second is to serve as intelligence screening. These cultural centers are used to spot and assess individuals in the country to get a sense of what are the political, economic, and cultural conditions in that country to be able to expand their more formal activities. That's how Iran's been able to go from 6 embassies in 2006 to 11 embassies in 2009. So in 4 years, they almost doubled the amount of embassies they had in the region at a high point of when Iran was active in the region. So the cultural centers is what I would call like the low-hanging fruit. It's the first point of entry, but it's a significant point of entry because a lot of naive, for lack of a better word, naive populations in Latin America don't understand what they're getting into until it's too late. And while they're halfway through their course and training in Iran, they realize that while Iran accepts you, it's like almost like a mafia. While they accept you into their political indoctrination, they don't easily let you get out.
Yes. A couple of toolbox questions, very practically speaking, for all three, if you would comment. And all of us, let me preface this by saying all of us and our distinguished moderator and host, as you see him on just about every night on Fox News these days, he really believes in the Fourth Amendment and protecting us about our constitutional rights, and I do too. But I've also used the forfeiture acts, both at the federal and state level, to fight drug trafficking and drug dealers. And as we move into more and more terrorism that is in place, and also the Bank Secrecy Acts and the cash transaction reports and the money laundering statutes, two questions. Are we doing enough for the money laundering to fight this threat as the money comes in and out of our country? And number two, are these negative things that are starting to arise at the state legislature and in Washington about our forfeiture laws because of some of the low-level abuses that are going on, is that hurting us, and are we going to be able to maintain that tool? And I don't mean for some little police department somewhere to get something, but I mean to stop terrorism dollars from floating in and out of this country and to seize assets and their money. How are we doing on that, and do y'all have any recommendations on how we can do it better?
Yeah, Tim, you may have a unique perspective on that question.
Thank you, Congressman. And, Commissioner, I would say from our highway enforcement in 2017, we see almost $25 million. $25 million is the cash cow that is supporting what we're talking about. If we take away the seizure and the asset forfeiture laws that take away that money or put such restraint on it that's happening in some areas around this country, these actors are going to get that money back, and we know what they're doing with it. And you're right, there has been some very low-level abuses, and law enforcement needs to be smarter on that. But overall, we've been very smart in seizing these funds, and this cash is the same as to a gambler. He needs cash to carry out his trade. These folks, Hezbollah and others, need cash to carry out their missions.
Commissioner Cole.
And when the law enforcement seizes this, do you see any weakness in the judicial system? Any loopholes that they're using to get through, get back on the streets? My feeling is when you capture somebody that's got that much cash, that has all the background for doing illicit things in our country, and then they get off on some legality because of human rights or something stepped on. And you said law enforcement has to do a smarter job, but I think we also have to encourage our judicial system to take a harder stand on this. Have you seen any weaknesses there that congressmen or even on a local level we can encourage?
Well, clearly we need to enforce the law and the narrative that law enforcement, this is not a cash cow for law enforcement. This is seizing assets from drug traffickers and other organizations, transnational and international organizations. The seizure of the money is taking it, as I said, taking that tool away. It's oftentimes we seize money from a drug courier and ask, is this your money? No. Would you sign an affidavit? Yeah, it's not my money. And they give the money to the seizing agency, basically on the spot. There's a process, depending on which state you're in. They take 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. But if they don't claim it within that time, the money resorts to the local government and it's dispersed accordingly, depending on what region you're in the law. So these folks, this is just this is the cost of doing business. They caught me this time. So I lose the $235,000 we seized this time, but we've got 4 loads that passed by. So we got $750,000 through, and it costs us $250,000. That's the cost of business. But oftentimes there's not even a challenge to that money or the drugs.
Here, gentlemen, here's what's going to get hard. Through my business dealings in Latin America, I can watch a Middle Eastern man buy a condo in Panama for $2 million with cryptocurrency, and you'll never see the money. The money's simply transferred from one crypto site to another crypto site. They can purchase land here in Florida with cryptocurrency, from Panama to here. Hold on to it, roll it over in 5 years, make money, a certain percentage goes right back to Lebanon. But one of the problems that I see in Latin America through my business dealings is using cryptocurrency to buy homes, automobiles, shops, land, things of that nature. And we have no grip on cryptocurrency right now. We're not recognizing it.
The extension of what Sergeant Major is saying is that, and this goes back to my earlier statement of where I see the real center of gravity on this issue is these collection of countries that are adopting these elements to basically house them and expand them throughout the region. The use of cryptocurrencies, the first state-backed cryptocurrency now in the history of the world is in Venezuela. It's called the Petro. It's not trading very high, but it also hasn't officially hit the public market until March 20th. In a couple weeks, I guess it'll be publicly available. This cryptocurrency is part of an extension of using digital payment systems that started all the way back in 2006. There was a concept called the Sucre in Ecuador that was used to be able to do trade between this collection of Bolivarian countries. That was 30% of it was already identified as being used for money laundering. The Sucre then extends to be able to use small little commercial banks to be able to, as an accounting system, to be able to make payments to loans for commodities. So for example, if this were to follow its natural extension, both the payment system and the accounting system of these countries would be completely undetected by U.S. financial authorities because it wouldn't pass a correspondent account or wouldn't pass any U.S. dollar denominated bank. So that means that they can pay back their loans to China, to Russia, and vice versa, use Iranian products and services to come into the country without any knowledge or oversight from the U.S. financial system, which would essentially put us back into the dark ages on anti-money laundering or counterfeit financing challenges.
Sure. Yeah, just real quickly, I can remember reading about this about a decade ago when they were talking about some of the cryptocurrencies before it was actually named, the ones we're familiar with now. But one of the things that strikes me about that, it's also extremely susceptible to interference. And so maybe one of the strategies we should be employing in the future is to be adaptive and organic in the way from a law enforcement military. I'm sure the military has already considered this, but from a law enforcement approach as far as disrupting the value of that currency, which is largely based strictly on trust. I mean, it's an algorithm, and so as such, it is susceptible to being manipulated. And there is certainly no guarantee by the United States to support a cryptocurrency or an algorithm base. So, I mean, it would seem to me that forward-thinking law enforcement, certainly at the federal level, but not the local level, could introduce strategies which take advantage. Moore's Law bites us, right? I mean, technology becomes obsoleted every 18 months, but the same thing is true for the criminal as well, too. Is there some opportunity to do that, to reach out and undermine these currencies, do some of those things of that nature?
Commissioner, I believe, Sheriff, I believe there's plenty of opportunities.
Don't wish Commissioner on me.
I believe there's plenty of opportunities for economic warfare in Latin America, cryptocurrency being one of those elements. I share your assessment that when Bitcoin was first introduced to me about 2010, 11, it was introduced to me by a national security actor that essentially told me this is a network analyst stream. You could see the ledgers and transactions. You might not know the individuals that are behind them, but you know the locations and you know where they're moving. And if you step back and just analyze it, it gives you a map. At least if you think a certain percentage of money launderers or illicit actors are using that.
That's when you get into the blockchain?
That's when you get into the blockchain, exactly. That's where you start to understand the movements of a network. In that sense, it was very beneficial, I think, for certain law enforcement intelligence activities. But that said, once you start to have state governments get involved into this game, they're essentially trying to morph into an element of currency wars. At the extension of a currency war would be an element that devalue the U.S. dollar to the point that the price of a commodity, say for example oil, is no longer valued enough to be able to be priced at U.S. currency. And if they are, if oil-producing countries were to just wake up and decide one day that they don't want to price the barrel to the dollar because the dollar's too weak, and then switch it to crypto, we lose in that game. And so by following that extension, I think the U.S.
The converse is true to that as well, though.
Correct. So the U.S. getting involved both at a regulatory level in the crypto world, I think is positive for the industry, to be able to legitimize the industry, but also at the intelligence level to be able to essentially mess with some of the state-backed cryptos that are becoming to emerge. Venezuela is the first. My understanding is that Russia and Iran are also experimenting with launching their own cryptos within the next year or so.
You would destabilize Latin America. They choose pretty heavily right now if you started messing with the crypto.
Congressman, if I may, as a follow-up, I had the pleasure of working for Sheriff Atkinson, and he's really good at jumping ahead of me on my question. And he got most of every bit of it, but I had one follow-up. Recently, when Bitcoin started getting to be, popular, our folks hit us on the computers, and we were actually a victim in our county in several different departments. And because I had 2 or 3 emails that went into there, I got hit as well. And everybody from FBI to state to local law enforcement to the smartest computer people we have, nobody could break the ransomware to do that, and they always demand Bitcoin. And I'm starting to wonder now, hearing more about the crypto currency, what can we do, and maybe it may be for our distinguished lawmakers in Washington, to make it where they can't use that, or it's not very financially advantageous to use it for other legitimate transactions, to stop this, because it is a serious threat to us, not just in drug smuggling and terrorism, but with our computer information systems and the ransomware. What should we do?
Not being an expert on cryptocurrencies, I'm not going to try to overstep my bounds and provide a technical recommendation. But I should say the Department of Treasury, and I spent time with the Terrorism and Financial Intelligence Office of that department, has an expanding team that's looking at cryptocurrencies from a threat finance perspective. They have experts that came from private industry that are now offering their service to help the Treasury Department get more knowledgeable about this. For example, the Venezuelan-backed crypto, there was a debate internally within the Treasury Department as to whether because Venezuela, many elements of Venezuela, the government is sanctioned, that would buying a unit of this crypto be considered a support to the Venezuelan government, which by de facto could expose a U.S. person to a sanction risk. They determined that is possible, although they can't do it with 100% certainty. So they created a disclaimer on one of the press releases that said that if you buy a petro, you may be subject to violation of U.S. sanctions. That message gets extended to all the individuals in Latin America that are increasingly going into the crypto business. So I think there's a knowledge gap that's being increasingly smaller. among U.S. government officials that are doing this, but I couldn't speak to the technical aspect.
I have gleaned 6 discrete policy recommendations that I'm going to include in my report to our substantive committees. First, that the designation of Hezbollah as a transnational criminal organization would be helpful. Second, that authorization for the Colombians to buy the F-16 would be helpful. Third, that conditioning aid in Latin America on deliverables in terms of fighting these threats would be preferable. Fourth, that a fusion center, as it related to the intelligence and information that we're collecting from a variety of agencies, would help us be more efficient. Fifth, that extending local government and local law enforcement capabilities into Latin America would build up a network to be able to better identify and combat the threats that we face. And sixth, and somewhat unexpected, is that if we had the right intel focus on cryptocurrencies, that it in fact could map us to some of the bad actors that use that system for danger. So that is remarkably helpful for me. I want to thank you gentlemen for joining us today. I want to thank my partners in local government for coming and contributing to the conversation. I continue to believe that we are at risk in this country of looking past Latin America and our hemisphere to some of the challenges we face in the world. And on behalf of all Floridians, and on behalf of the country, and in particular, on behalf of the Northwest Floridians, particularly engaged in this fight, I think it's important to remain focused and to advocate for these policy solutions. If you're here today and would like to follow up and learn more about these issues, you can sign up for our newsletter at gates.house.gov. That way you can receive updates as legislation moves forward. I'll point out this is the second field hearing of this type that my office has hosted. The last we hosted in Tallahassee on Chinese intellectual property theft, and already that field hearing has produced legislative text in reform bills to foreign investment to stop threats. So these are incredibly helpful to be able to gather information outside of Washington, outside of the Beltway, outside of the swamp, so that we can operationalize that advice into tangible policy outcomes. One final announcement. I notice we have a number of young people here today, and one of the best perks of being your congressman is that I get to nominate some of the greatest patriots that we have in Northwest Florida for academy service at our military academies. And we will be hosting informational sessions on what academy service entails, how to, if you're a young person interested in academy service, how to make yourself a competitive and attractive candidate, and to learn more about deadlines and the process that entails. We'll be hosting an organizational meeting March 27th at Pace High School at 6 o'clock p.m. And we'll be hosting another informational session Thursday, March 29th at Niceville High School at 6 o'clock p.m. Finally, again, I want to thank all who've contributed to the logistics of this event, both on my team and here at the museum. We are incredibly proud, in particular, of the Flight Academy that we host next door. A number of our local and state officials have been involved in ensuring that we have that capability, and it is particularly helpful because Speaker Ryan's son likes to do summer camp at the Flight Academy. And so I'm always able to get the speaker's attention when I call him while his son is in Northwest Florida. So it's a unique opportunity to highlight our priorities. But thank you to everyone. Oh yes, Tim, did you have a final comment?
Yeah, Congressman, if you would indulge me just 1 minute. First of all, let me thank you and your committee to inviting us, the Gulf Coast side, over to make some comments and contribute. But I do want to bring a little story that I think the sheriff and the commissioners and the mayor may find interested and be happy about. Is that in November we stopped a gentleman in Jackson County, Mississippi, through our major investigations team with 13.8 pounds of cocaine destined for Pensacola, your backyard. Not 3 months later, the Calcasieu Parish in Louisiana stopped the same individual with 12 pounds, 12.2 pounds of cocaine, again destined for your backyard, that was seized. There's 25 pounds of cocaine that was en route to your neighborhoods that was seized by the Gulf Coast HIDA, and that investigation, with our cooperation with our federal partners, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and our initiative here in Northwest Florida, is continuing as we speak. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention, let you know we're making a difference in your backyard.
Well, we greatly appreciate it. Please share with all of your team members and partner members how grateful we are, and that I firmly believe that with smarter policy decisions in Washington, executed by some of the bravest and best patriots that we can imagine, downrange and in theater, we can take a bite out of this threat, and that we can prepare ourselves for the world that we face to come. So with that, I would conclude this field hearing, and I thank you all for attending.